It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to give this talk to you today. I'm sorry it's not in person, that it has to be virtual and from a distance, but I'm very grateful to Ian Hickey and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to share some thoughts with you on Celtic Christianity. I want to talk about sort of a tradition, an intellectual tradition in Ireland of a certain version of Christianity going back to, in fact, the early centuries, 5th, 6th century, and finding its culmination in the 8th and 9th century with the philosophy of John Scotus Erugena, meaning Erugena, born in Ireland, Erugenas, and developing throughout a certain, cultural poetic tradition in Ireland, up until what we might call the reign of Jansenism, of ultramontane Jansenism, really in the 19th century, with the Maynoothization of Ireland. Not that there weren't many great people in Maynooth, John Hume being one of them, and many, many more. Some of my greatest friends were seminarians and indeed ordained priests from Maynooth. But I'll explain what I mean by that. And I want to sort of distinguish between what I would call a benign and a malign version of Irish Catholicism. And I begin with the benign, say a word about the malign, and then return to the intellectual tradition of what I would call Celtic Christianity. So personally, to start with a question, where do you speak from? My professor, Paul Ricard in Paris, when I entered his seminar for the first time, said to every student, PhD student sitting in a circle at the table, "D'où parlez-vous? Where do you speak from? Where do you come from?" So I grew up, in terms of my Christianity, in Ireland, in Cork City, to quite a devout family, but an extraordinarily open and tolerant family when it came to the practice of Christianity. And I remember as a very young child making May altars with my mother, who had a devotion to Mary, and a very joyful one, a very, what I would call, panentheistic one. God is in all things. So we learned as children, myself and my 6 siblings, that God was in the flowers of the May altar, that God was in nature, God was in horses and dolphins and dogs. My mother and father were great lovers of animals and of people. So there was a sense in which God is in all people, all animals, all things. And it was very unpunitive version of Christianity. It was, I think, very true to the gospel, in fact, that God is in all things. It's not pantheism, God is all things, because then you have to justify the question of evil. How is God there in Auschwitz, etc.? But God is potentially there in all things. And I recall on one occasion, my mother driving us to the sea and all the children in the back of the car. And as we reached Fanstown or wherever it was and came over the brow of the hill, she taught us a little song, which was, "I see the sea and the sea sees me." And there was that sense of double sensation in one's relation to the world. There was a sacredness in things which expressed itself as a reciprocal mutual relationship between the seer and the seen. So if you see the trees are seeing you. If you're seeing the horses are seeing you. If you're seeing the sea is seeing you. I see the sea and the sea sees me. And this was a very lasting lesson, actually, that we are part of an interactive sort of interbeing, to use the word of the Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. But while my parents weren't Buddhists, they had a version of Christianity that was very much a love of the sacred in all things. And that expressed itself in all sorts of ways. Attitude to the poor, very, very committed to helping the poor and identifying empathically with the suffering of the poor, the Vincent de Paul, the handicapped communities, the disabled, etc. So I got a very benign version of things, and I loved Holy Communion, my first Holy Communion. I loved my confirmation. I love the sacraments. Wasn't great for confession because, I suppose we had a very Pelagian view of sin that actually wasn't much of it around. Now, you might call that innocence, but in any case, there was an affirmation of grace in nature. They weren't opposed, as in, say, Augustine or in Jansenism, and we'll come to that in a moment. Then I had the good fortune of going to Glenstraw Abbey, where with the Benedictines, I learned again a very tolerant and benign version of Christianity. Several of the monks had come back from France, Strasbourg, Paris, where they'd been educated in by the Dominicans and the Jesuits, Congar and others in the whole Vatican II opening, Risorgimento and all that. So that was a very, as I say, intellectually benign and inspiring view of Christianity, which was very much in dialogue with atheism. And our first Christian doctrine teacher taught us that if you want to understand Christianity, you want to understand the arguments against it. By Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. By Nietzsche, God is Dead. By Sartre, Religion in the Form of Bad Faith. Freud, it's an infantile illusion. Marx, it's the opium of the people. We learned all that. And so Christianity was part of an ongoing intellectual, vibrant discussion. So that was the benign. And intellectually, likewise, I was very interested in Catholic cinema, Bresson, Catholic literature, Maria Graham Greene and whatnot. And of course, I saw James Joyce and the Irish writers, Heaney and others, as very much part of that open Celtic Christianity. And it seems maybe odd to talk about Joyce in terms of Celtic Christianity, but I'll come back to it if I have time to say just what I mean by is a certain version of an Irish European mystical Christianity, which I think is there in Joyce and in his notion of a certain Eucharistic epiphany. All right, so much for the benign in terms of my own experience. And I will come back to the Irish philosophical tradition of Celtic mysticism and panentheism shortly. But I first of all want to say a word about the malign. In fact, before I leave the benign, I'd like to quote Patrick Hederman in his recent book, Crimson and Gold, on this benign tradition of Celtic Christianity. I'm quoting page 165. The Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain in the 6th century and the Frankish conquest of Gaul meant that the Irish Church was cut off from Rome for hundreds of years and left to its own development and devices. This allowed it to express itself distinctively in the great monastic foundations which gave it a unique cultural identity in the 6th and 7th centuries. The flourishing of Clonard, Clonfert, Derry, Kildare and Lismore, among others, allowed native rulers to be drawn up for all such, native rules to be drawn up for all such monastic foundations. Not a single continental religious order was established in Ireland for the first 5 centuries of Christianity. In other words, it was not ultramontane from beyond the mountains, from Rome and such. Ireland developed its own particular brand. The outstanding figure of this native variety was Columba of Iona, from whose influence the Celtic version of Christianity spread further afield. And of course, after Columba, there was Columbanus and Gallus in the 6th century, who traveled through Europe, left Bangor in Northern Ireland, and traveled through England, France, Lombardy, the Frankish kingdoms, into Italy, founding various monastic settlements in Luxeuil in France, in Bobbio in Italy, and so on. In fact, my first novel, Sam's Fall, was based on the journey of Columbanus and Gallus to Europe. And this is what Joyce talks about in his famous Trieste lectures on Ireland. I think the Ireland of saints and scholars, he called it, where he talked about the Hibernicization of Europe and the Europeanization of Ireland. There was a wonderful cross-fertilization between the native Celtic tradition and the European tradition, but not in a Romanizing way, or as we later see, a Manuthizing way. So much for the benign. Now to a word or two about the malign. So here is, again, Patrick Hedderman in his recent book. I know he's speaking to you at this conference, so maybe you will get some of this. But he says, you know, the Irish Roman Catholic Church is 3 carriages away from the engine. How do we uncouple ourselves from the 2 carriages which are getting in the way, the Roman and the Irish? Now, I take that on board, and what he means by the Irish in this context, which I'll now explain, the malign, ultramontane Jansenist culture, does have to go. We have to unhook the carriage. As for the Irish, I think there was an Irish nationalist church, which sort of believed that Rome would save us from England. So, you know, we save ourselves from the English Empire and we buy into the Roman. So I accept that version of Irish nationalist Catholicism needs to go, but I'm talking about another version of an Irish Celtic panentheistic tradition. And I'll say more about that shortly. But back to Hedderman and the malign. So the Catholicism of an Irish kind, I quote, page 152, was largely a product of imported 19th century spiritualities, emphasizing personal holiness and condemning our evil human nature and untrustworthy instincts. It has been described as Irish Jansenism, and it presented a grim theology, rigid, authoritarian, and moralistic. It was certainly responsible for much fear, guilt, and pessimism. According to the World Health Organization statistic reports, between 1961 and 1968, the Republic of Ireland had the highest hospitalization treatment rate for mental illness in the world. So this is the Ireland of the tomb babies, the buried babies, the statue of the Virgin of Grenard, the famous poem about Anne Lovett by Paula Meehan, and the countless stories that we've had since about child abuse, about corporal punishment, cruelty, cover-ups, and so on. This is what Hedderman calls the colonization. Cardinal Paul Cullen, colonization of Irish Christianity. I call it the Manuthization, but there are different names for it. Irish Catholicism, as we know it today, concludes Hedderman, dates from the 16th or 17th century. The Reformation, especially in its English incarnation, produced in Ireland the paranoid, insular, nationalistic version of Catholicism, which came to fruition in the 20th century, the 19th, 20th century, so Victorianism, Jansenism, and so on. All right. Now, let me then agree with Hedderman that we need to unhitch Irish Catholicism from the malign version of Irish Christianity and the Roman centralizing version, which Hedderman, as a Benedictine abbot and monk, rails against in this very prophetic and inspirational book. But he rails against it in the name of a genuine Irish Christianity and indeed Irish Catholicism. How do we demonethize Ireland? How do we declericalize Ireland? You know, how do we get over the culture that produced war in Northern Ireland and so much physical, sexual, and mental abuse in the North and South? How do we retrieve a genuine Catholic spirituality from a benign and benighted betrayal of it in more recent centuries? All right, so back to John Scotus Erugena, who I mentioned earlier. There was a certain Scotist, as I like to call it, version of Celtic Christianity represented by Duns Scotus, a Scottish Irish philosopher, Dalrida, it was all one in those days, who had a notion that God was in, the divine was in all beings in their particularity. Now, Jeremy Hopkins would be inspired by this with his notion of inscape and instress. That is the particular unique specificity, the heitas, H meaning this, here, behold, of things that actually represents their most sacred nature. And Duns Scotus also had the idea of the univocity of being, that the being of God and the being of things, of humans and of natural things, is the same. So that's one Scotus philosopher. Another was Pelagius and the Pelagian heresy, who actually believed that grace was in nature and human beings, that very much in tune with, although Pelagius means seafarer, and he was, again, from Ireland, and it sort of connecting with the patristic mysticism of the Greeks, which later, survived in Greek Orthodoxy, that there is the possibility of theosis, I think it's called, and theopoiesis, of the coming to divinity of things and people. God is man fully alive, this principle of mystical Christianity, mystical humanist Christianity, in fact. So Pelagius was a second Scotist philosopher, and a third was our own John Scotus, famously on the Irish, whatever it was, pound note or £5 note, who grew up in Ireland, was taught in Ireland, was invited by the King of France, Charles Le Chauve, to come to the court in Lyon and translate the works of the Pseudo-Denis, the Areopagite, and others, Maximus Confessor, from Greek into Latin, because so few scholars at the time, that's the 9th century after the Dark Ages, were able to command two languages, not to mention the fact that they had their own native Gaelic language. So these were three Scottish thinkers, all of whom proposed a form of panentheism. God is in all things. And Erugena, in particular, had the idea of a running God, that God runs through all things, what he called the Deus Currens. So let me run through a few of the particular Irish traits of John Scotus Erugena as they informed and inflected what I call Irish Christianity, Irish mystical Celtic Christianity. First of all, I'd like to begin with a brief quote from Dermot Moran in an essay on Erugena, a book I edited in 1984 called The Irish Mind, where he says as follows about Erugena's panentheist view of God as a live power in the natural world. I quote, "The accusation of heresy excluded Erugena from the main Western philosophical tradition for many centuries. Yet even in his own time, he was regarded as an outsider, a vir barbarus, as the Vatican librarian called him, an advina, a stranger, a famous Irishman, etc. He stood out as a stranger in France and presumably coined the name Erugena to express this curious phenomenon, an Irishman versed in philosophical wisdom. His Irish traits included his love of nature, his resistance to authority, which reminds us of Columbanus and Columba, his use of imagery, of sea voyaging, again, maritime sacredness of the aquamarine world, and peregrination. He was a wanderer, recalling Brendan the Navigator, or Wilfrid Strabo's remark that wandering was second nature to the Irish. Again, chiming with Joyce's idea, that the true Irish culture is the Hibernicizing of Europe and the Europeanizing of Ireland, the voyaging, the journey, the peregrinatio, the circumnavigatio, is all these, Latin early medieval terms for the spiritual journey, which was also a geographical, natural journey, a physical journey. His love of learning might suggest a schooling in the famous monasteries of early Ireland. Think of the Skelligs or Clonmacnoise or whatever. Borges, in an interview myself and Seamus Heaney had with him in 1982 in Dublin for the centenary of Joyce's birth, had this to say about Erugena, which I found fascinating. He said, this is Borges, the Argentinian writer. "I loved reading Erugena's De Divisione Naturae, which taught that God creates himself through the creation of his creatures in nature. I discovered that Berkeley's doctrine of the creative power of the mind was already anticipated by Erugin's metaphysics of creation, and that this in turn recurred in several other Irish writers, whose thinking is remarkably akin to Erugin's system of things, coming from the mind of God and returning to him. I love the idea that all genuine creation stems from a metaphysical nothingness, what Erugina called the nihil of God, which resides at the very heart of our existence. So he sort of sets up this, Bogue sets up this sort of imaginary tradition of Celtic Christianity and metaphysics running from Erugina down through Berkeley, who so inspired Yeats, of course, and needless to say, the philosophy in turn of Joyce. So Ezra Pound, another very important modernist writer, writes of the school of Celtic philosophers in the 9th century in Lyon in France, the Carolingian sort of kingdom of Europe at the time. And these included Erugina himself and his band of fellow Celtic monks and brothers and scholars, Sedulius Scotus, Martin Hibernensius, and Fergus of Lyon. And Ezra Pound praises Erugin in particular and his migrant compatriots for their famous wit, known as hilaritas, for bringing Greek learning and the Eastern patristic traditions into the Carolingian world. And hilaritas was, hence our word hilarity, the celebration of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum, as Cusanus would later call it, the bringing together of contradictions, which of course does two things. It leads to prayer and it leads to laughter. And the two are indistinguishable, as we know, going back to Isaac, which means Hebrew, in Hebrew, laughter, because that's what Sarah did when the strangers came and they said, you will have a child in a year when I return. And she said, that's impossible. I haven't had my periods and Abraham is 300 years old. It's not going to happen. And she laughs. There is an hilaritas about the sacred, where the impossible becomes possible. So you've got to be prepared to entertain impossibles and compossibles in order to move forward. This is what Mark Hetteman calls teratology, a sort of a monstrous logic of opposition, where you go beyond binary polar contradictions in the creation of a third genre, which seems monstrous at the beginning to our normal logic, but to our normal formal logic, A is A, it cannot be non-A, of non-contradiction and identity, but creates another kind of logic, closer to dialectical logic, if you will, poetic logic, mystical logic. Okay, Bamford, in his famous book on Erugina, calls this merry troop of Celts who went to Lyon in the 9th century to bring, as it were, patristic learning and Celtic learning back into the Europe that had been so damaged by the Dark Ages. And he writes of an ecumenical cosmopolitanism, explaining it thus: to be a Celt meant to be at home everywhere. It meant to have the gift of languages, the ability to empathize and be at one with everyone and everything. To be dialogue incarnate, conversation, to know the word in the word. A sort of a Celtic theopoetics, if you will, that he praises. And he goes on to say, to sort of compare this to the Irish illustrated manuscripts. Many of you will know of these, the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, where you get greyhounds and whirligigs and donkeys, morning glory, fir trees, ferns, strangers, gods, and monsters, all interacting in a divine human animal comedy. Or think of the vagina gaping shillingigs played over sacred thresholds in Ireland, the profane and the sacred. Again, the opposites brought together and celebrated. When it came to philosophy, Erugina's comic vision was somewhat more epistemological, to be sure. It meant replacing the standard metaphysical logic of either or with the capacious dialectical logic of both and. Here, the old polarities of grace and nature, divine versus the human, infinite versus the finite, male versus female, light versus darkness, spirit versus earth, were overcome in a daring eagle's flight, to use Erugina's favorite poetic metaphor for John's Gospel. This mystical flight went beyond the polar alternatives of both apophatic and cataphatic theology, and anticipated the coincidentia oppositorum of Cusanus and the modern Rhine mystics, Meister Eckhart and others. So in The Voice of the Eagle, the Heart of Celtic Christianity, Bamford goes on, he says, Erugena possessed an impeccable ability to tolerate contradiction and paradox, but also sheer chaos and confusion. There was no light without darkness. His theopoetic vision saw the creation of nature as a dialectic arising from non-being into being and returning to divinity before and beyond being. So this was very much his vision. Erugena himself, quote, makes no opposition between being and consciousness or consciousness and nature. These are complementaries within a single unity, poles of a unique process whose ground is divine consciousness and whose existence is divine possession. So this is actually another word for panentheism, another description of panentheism. God is in everything, and everything is in God, but God is not everything, and everything is not God. That's the difference between pantheism and panentheism. The world is sacramental, the sacred is potentially in all things if we perceive it and relate to it phenomenologically in a way that is receptive and attentive to the call within nature of all things, the call of icheitas, of thisness, of the specific, unique singularity of each thing, of each created thing. All right, let me then quote Erugena himself in the De Divisione Naturae, the division of nature, where he says, we should not understand God and the creature as two things removed from one another, separate from one another, but as one and the same thing. For the creature subsists in God, and God is created in the creature in a wonderful and ineffable way, making himself manifest, invisible, making himself visible. And so he comes up with this wonderful idea of the running God. God runs through all things, the Deus courens. When theos, I quote him again, when theos, the Greek for God, is drawn from the verb theo, I run, it is rightly interpreted as the one who runs, because God runs across everything that exists and is never impeded. He fills all in his course. As in the verse of scripture, his word runs with swiftness. So he concludes, again, this metaphor of the running God. If God is therefore called the one who runs, curus diciter, it is because he causes everything that exists to run from a state of non-existence to a state of existence. The world is unfurled from one end of the world to the other, and he runs with haste across all existing things. That is to say, that the word creates them all instantaneously, and that the word becomes all in all. So for Erugena, panentheism is a form of God-making, a form of theopoetics, quite literally. Making, facere, is being, esse. So poiesis is existence. Creation is existence. They are not separate. They are not separate activities. Revelation and nature are radically interactive. All right, so I will conclude my few words on Erugena by saying that this notion of sort of a panentheist poetics of Celtic Christianity came to its fruition in Erugena, where being runs like a lightning, life-giving river through creation, connecting and reconnecting all persons and things, divine, human, animal, from beginning to end. Now, this view of Erugena, I don't think disappeared entirely from the Irish psyche. You find it in the Midnight Court, in Celtic literature of hilaritas and laughter, and the celebration of contradictions and of both and thinking rather than either or, polar oppositions. You find it also in the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh. Think, for example, of his beautiful line about the Trinity in The Great Hunger. These men know God the Father in a tree. The Holy Spirit is the rising sap, and Christ will be the green leaves that will come at Easter from the sealed and guarded tomb. Or think of Heaney's poem, The Diviner. the carnal contact with the sacred underground being of things, or of Clon MacNoise, the vision, of the boat putting down the anchor onto the altar of the monks as they partake of the Eucharist. Or think of Joyce, who in the Emmaus chapter has Stephen and Bloom come together in a Eucharistic moment of encounter, juxtaposing the reconciliation between Ulysses when he comes back to Ithaca with the swineherd Emmaus, and the road to Emmaus, spelled, spelling, there's two M's in one and one in the other, but Joyce is playing on that, where Jesus meets with the disciples, the risen Christ meets with the disciples, and they break bread, just as Bloom and Stephen do. And of course, at the end of Ulysses, you have the sharing of the kiss, the Eucharistic kiss between Bloom and Molly. This is all part, I would say, of a Celtic Christianity. You also find it in the music and musicology of Nóri ní Riana Mícheál Súleabháin and their sons. You find it in the verses of Nuala ní Gcónail, the Irish verses of Nuala ní Gcónail, or Mícheál Ó Síl. You find it in the recent writings of Mangan Megan in Irish and English. Think of his wonderful new book, 32 Words for a Field, where again, the Irish language, the Celtic resonances of the Irish language, celebrate the specific sacredness of all things, whether they be seaweeds or fields or stones or animals or humans. So, Alistair MacIntyre at the end of his wonderful book, After Virtue, says that the only future for Western civilization, and certainly for Western Christianity, is a new meeting between St. Benedict and Trotsky. Well, I think I get his point, but I think you might add to that dialogue a trialogue, and have maybe St. Columbanus join the conversation, or Gallus, or John Scotus Erugena, or St. Bridget. But in any case, I think the future of Irish Christianity in a benign version means, one, that we acknowledge the malign heritage and heresy, I would say, indeed, and then that we try to retrieve from the remnants of a radical iconoclastic critique of the malign tradition, we try to retrieve something of this genuine, ongoing potential for a Celtic Christianity that goes back, 1,200 years, more, 1,500 years, and I think can bring us into the future. And I think that's also what my friend and colleague, Mark Patrick Hederman, is gesturing towards in his conclusion to Crimson and Gold, his new book. So thank you for your attention, and I wish I was there to engage in question and answer with you, but perhaps another time. Thank you.